Okay, well it's been nearly a week since I last worked on this camera. I've been busy getting optical upgrades of my own, getting a cataract dealt with, and I'm ready to start work on it again. So my next task here is to solder back the wires. Now the wires we have in question are our flash connection here, which solders to this point on the back of the shutter, and there's a switch built into the shutter, two contacts here and here, which are soldered to these two wires here. Now I'm going to solder those on as they are, and I'm going to paint around those wires with some clear lacquer afterwards to make sure that there's no likelihood of a short at that point. I was going to put some heat shrink tubing on there, but the wires are very fine and I think it will make them fairly inflexible if I put any on there, and I might have trouble tucking the wires back into the hole when I'm fitting the shutter. And fitting the shutter is always a bit fraught on the best of occasions. So that's what I'll do. Oh, one thing I did achieve on here since you last looked was I've put a Leatherette patch on the advance lever. So my next task is to solder these wires on and then see that get this shutter fitted back in place. That's always entertaining. I've found that it works best if you cock the shutter here, make sure that the cam here is revolved all the way back to the stop position, and offhand I can't remember if it's that direction or that direction, I'll find out shortly. Make sure that this lever is in the raised position so that it comes in on top of the shutter release arm on the back of the shutter at this point. And of course, in theory, everything will pop straight back in place. I do have a shim that goes onto the back of that lens. Now the shim's purpose, well, it can serve a couple of purposes. Shim's at the back of the lens. In this case, a solid shim like that, because it's relatively thick, probably provides sufficient clearance that all of these levers will move smoothly. And if you delete the shim thinking you don't need it, and you'll compensate by moving the adjustment of the front cell, often you'll find that the shutter may not release correctly, particularly on the B setting from memory. Anyway, soldering first, and then you can see me put this back on. Well, I soldered my wires back in place, put a touch of clear nail varnish around those wires where the insulation looked a bit thin, and fitted the shutter back to the camera body. Now, once I'd fitted the shutter back to the camera body, my next problem was to check the focus of the lens. And immediately I was up against a problem. There's no practical way to set this shutter to stay open on B at full aperture. It just doesn't allow for it. So I thought, well, there's some trick to that, but I can't remember exactly what it is. So what I did was I just removed the front rings from the shutter, which of course allows me to independently control the shutter speed and the aperture. Made sure it was set to B, made sure the aperture was fully open, and my front lens group, I just put that in, focused it at infinity correctly on a ground glass screen. Made note, I made a small mark on the front lens group pointing straight up. I checked where that lens group, where the front lens would be once it was screwed all the way down tight as far as it could go, and made a note of that. Then I could remove the front lens group, put the rings and everything back in place, and refit the front lens group. Now it's a multi-start thread, so I had to try 2 or 3 times before I hit the right spot, so that when it was screwed all the way down, the mark came to where I had noted that the mark would come to, and I knew that was correct, so I had it in the correct threads, if you like. So then I had to just rotate the lens until my mark was exactly at the top, which is where I'd marked it to be for infinity. And then I could fit the focus scale ring on the front. and there were just the 3 screws binding through from the outside on that, the ones that I dealt to earlier, and then I could put the ring, the numbers scale ring, onto that front piece. So my shutter and lens assembly is all complete. I've checked to make sure that when you look through the viewfinder you can see the meter needle swinging. How appropriate that is, I do not know. I'm a bit suspicious of it because, as I said on a previous occasion, the needle on the meter at the top was certainly not running in a straight line. It wasn't running in a nice clean radial from the centre of that meter movement. Somebody had bent it for some reason. Now presumably they bent it because they wanted the needle to move more to one side than the other to increase or decrease the exposure as indicated. That wouldn't have been the correct way to go about it, but perhaps it worked well enough. At this stage I've dealt with the camera body except to the top cover. Now the top cover, the problem with this particular camera of course is that it is missing the lens from the back here. I'm still not clear how that came to get out, because my understanding of the matter is that it cannot fit out of the back of the cover, that it was too big to pass out this way. It's fitted from the inside, and so the only way it could have got out was for it to be pushed inwards. Now if it had been pushed inwards, why is the retainer plate and things still in place? So that is very much a mystery. The only possibility I'm left with here is that somebody dismantled this, removed the 2 screws which hold this viewfinder assembly in place in the top cover, slid it out, the rear lens piece disappeared into the distance, and as a result, when they put that back in there, they've lost the lens. It's gone somewhere. I'm certainly going to have to sort out an answer for that one. I've just checked. I've got a top cover from a very similar camera here. This is a Retinette IIA. Very much the same finder. And this one, I do have a lens in there. So I've got something to go to if I need to. In the meantime, I'm going to check through my pile of lenses and various bits and pieces, because quite possibly I do have a viewfinder lens to suit this one. But I can use this as my model. I can use this as a go-to to find the part I need to copy or find a duplicate of. And failing everything else, I can take this part. So, off searching for pieces. Well, looking at the parts from my Retinette IIB parts camera there, I'm looking to see what I actually need. Now there's a plain piece of glass. That's the piece that goes to the outside of the finder, the piece that you face. Then there's a paper spacer washer, a paper ring. Then there's the lens. Now the lens is plano-convex. The convex side faces forward. But those are the pieces I need. Now the plain glass, I've found a piece of plain glass. I'm checking to see if it's actually the same thickness I've got there. It looks like it. So I've got my plain glass. Now the lens, that's quite thick, and I believe it's actually plastic. So I've got to check through my parts now and see if I've got a plastic lens. And worse than that, I've got to find a plastic lens that's actually in a fit state to use, because frequently they are not. Well, there's one there. It's very dirty looking, but it may do the job. And of course I need a paper washer too. And the paper washer, the spacer washer, may be the hardest thing of all to find. Because it's quite likely I do not have one. Bits like that, of course, just tend to get blown away and lost, particularly in stray spare parts piles. But at least I know what I'm looking for now. And worst comes to the worst, I'm using these components out of my Retinette 1B camera here instead. So that's what I've got to achieve anyway. Worst case scenario, I'm using those parts. Otherwise I'm using those parts. But I do need to clean up this top cover regardless, because it is very, very grimy. I'll clean this up, then see about putting my viewfinder back together inside it. Before I reassemble the viewfinder assembly, I need to clean this because it's very dusty. So the loose components like that lens I'll remove. And this is the bright line finder component. And multiple pieces make this up. And all I've got left in the housing here is the semi-silvered mirror and the front surface silvered mirror here. Now the semi-silvered mirror in particular, that the viewfinder image is through that glass, and that glass is very, very grimy. Now if I clean that with some glass cleaner and cotton bud, I'm almost certainly I'd end up wiping the silver off it and it won't work properly. So I'm going to clean this in the ultrasonic cleaner. I've also got this component in here. This is a plastic lens, condenser lens. That's relatively robust, but I'll clean that in there too. The other components are less of a nuisance. The only thing I'm vaguely concerned about is the viewfinder lens here, because that is relatively soft plastic. It's often a little bit hazy. But whatever I get out of it, it's going to be a lot better than having no viewfinder lens at all. So, off to the ultrasonic cleaner for this, and then I'll be back. While I've got that back from the ultrasonic cleaner, I've cleaned up all the remaining glass and lenses. Now, that viewfinder lens, as I said, it was plastic and had a bit of haze to it. It's still got a bit of haze to it. It's not as bad as it was. I cleaned that with some Perspex polish, which is not my preferred thing to do, but it certainly worked. So I've had to assemble the finder just to find out whether it was actually going to be any good. As it turns out, it does look pretty good. So everything here now is all back together in terms of the finder. Now I have come to a conclusion. Now basically it wasn't possible for that viewfinder to escape by itself. There's no doubt in my mind about that. What must have happened, and there's no other possible explanation, is that somebody removed the two screws that hold the finder to the top cover, slid the finder out of the top cover, and then didn't know how to put the viewfinder back together, and so it went away lost. That's really about the only option there. I can't think of any other even vaguely reasonable explanation for that. However, it doesn't matter. The main thing is that the top cover's back together and the viewfinder does work nicely, and I can continue on with putting it back together. The top cover's cleaned up quite well. That was very, very grimy, but I stripped it down completely and then cleaned that in hot water with some dishwashing detergent and a small toothbrush, and then reassembled the frame counter, shoe, etc. back to it, and no, it's come up well. So next, to fit the top cover to the camera, I suppose. Well, I had a bit of trouble, and I needed to pull the finder back out to adjust something I'd done. So it looks like you might have time for me be able to see me put this back together regardless. Let's see what we've got. That's the plain glass I'm putting into that piece there. That's the little piece that holds the rear eyepiece. Now the paper washer I'm using, that's the one I've taken from the Retinette IIA. And after I dismantled that, I lost that completely because it was stuck through static to this blower and I couldn't find the thing anywhere. It drove me crazy looking for it. I did have an alternative in mind. I was going to use a spring, spacer spring from a Retinette 2C type, which would have achieved much the same thing, but it would have left things under a little bit of tension I didn't want. Anyway, so I've got the lens itself there, flat side towards the glass. Here's my top cover. Now the finder assembly can go back in here now. While I was looking for that little paper ring, I thought, oh, I've got a Retinette IIA about here somewhere that I can rob that part from. Well, that turned out to be a waste of time because that piece was actually missing in that particular camera. Right, so the finder assembly is in position. Lift this into place. It should drop down into that recess. And here's the spring that holds it in place. Now I'm going to bow that the other way with my fingers. Slide that down over that lens. Oh, it's just popped out. Hang on, have another go at that. No, it doesn't want to stay. Can't be holding my mouth right. Now that doesn't really want to stay in the slot. Not sure why that should be. Okay. Well, I've got one here that I took from something else. Let's see if that'll... Still doesn't want to stay in the slot. It's like it's not quite wide enough. Very interesting. It seemed to fit fine the first time around. I'm going to have to look at this. I wonder if my viewfinder lens is sticking out too proud. Is it exactly the same? Looks exactly the same as that one I've taken from the Retinette IIB. Right, let's have another look. Is the finder shifted in the housing slightly? That's a possibility. Perhaps it's sitting too far to the back. That might be it. Let's try that. That's all sitting in place. And I will put some clear lacquer on that to make sure that nothing shifts in there, I think, at this stage. I'll just let that set up in that orientation. I don't want it to stand it on its head and have that run down inside there just at the moment in case it runs down and settles on the lens, which would be problematic to say the least. Okay, that'll do. Now, have viewfinder lens to the front. The exterior glass to the finder and the mask that slides down between them. Lift out that mask. Front glass goes in there. The mask's in place. Just checking the look of that from the front. That looks okay. I'll look through the finder and see how it looks. That's good. Frame lines are in the right place. I'm quite happy with that. Let's see if I can get this piece on here now. Well, that was a bit of an unexpected struggle. Well, that's not the right way up. That's not sitting right. Something odd going on here. This is not sitting as I expect it to sit. Okay, is it around the wrong end? I've got the wrong end in place there. Let's try that. It's a bit it's an odd shape, this spring. It's not dead flat. That looks better. That's better. Let me check my finder again. Yeah, no, that's a good view. Quite pleased with that. So, there's my top housing. That eyepiece is no joy to look at. It's okay to look through. And here I have the camera. And what I'm mostly studying here is the position of this needle. I suspect that it's bent too far to the right. Which would tend, I think, to indicate you need more exposure than is normally the case. Somebody might have made that bend in order to adjust it. Given the length of the needle and the shape of the needle, it's possible that the bend I'm seeing it towards the top of the needle was compensating for another bend that I'm not seeing down below. I'm inclined to think that I'll give that the benefit of the doubt for the moment. I'm going to have to spend some time testing this to see if I can work out whether it actually gives the correct exposure, because I'm not 100% convinced that it will do. I notice there's a screw missing here. Is there room for a screw to sit there? I think so. I'm going to find a screw and put it there, I think. So, screw with a round head. That one there's probably a match. I really wanted one with a smaller head than that. I'm not sure I'll have one. Let's find out. Yes, I know the sort of screw I need. Let's take that one out. At least the exposure meter reacts to light, as you can tell from the way that needle swings backwards and forwards as I move my hand across the front of it. And the only point in question is what level of accuracy we have with that meter. The top cover's not sitting down properly. Something to do with the shutter release. That's better. Now it's sitting down properly. Alright, I'll put the screws in the top cover. I want to close this up now, and I think I'm pretty much done, apart from checking that meter, of course. I've got to check the meter. Where are the screws from this particular camera gone? These ones will do nicely. By this stage I've had 2 parts cameras acting as donors. The frame counter, I noticed, is not lined up particularly well. I think I'm going to have to go back in and look at that. And the rewind knob we want. And I think it's this one. Yeah, one of these is quite marked. Let's replace that screw with a better example, I think. One thing I do know here is that someone has had this apart, didn't know what they were doing, left pieces out later. There's every likelihood that this is not as it once was. Right, that's a tidy looking rewind knob. Now I'm going to go away and see if I can determine what the exposure, the suggested exposure is like on this camera. See if I can find out whether the meter is comparatively accurate. With a selenium celled meter, there's every likelihood that it'll never be accurate. It's just too old now, and those cells have lost too much sensitivity over time. But if it can be made to work reliably within about a stop, it'll be good enough for colour negative film or black and white. It'll never be good enough to be used with colour slide film. Wish me luck. I'm away to waste an awful lot of time on the tester trying to figure out whether I'm going to get proper exposures or not. Well, I've had this on the shutter speed tester. At this end of the scale there, that's roughly 1/500. It's a bit slower than that, but that's roughly probably intended to be 500. Here it's in the middle of the scale where the sun symbol is, so that's about 125. And down at this end that's quite slow, that's at around a 30th. So it is progressive. I've checked it outside to see what sort of settings I'm getting. It looked to me that it was actually fairly credible. It was testing a 125th of a second set to ISO 125 here. It's a fairly dull day out there. It was suggesting, gave me an aperture of around f11, f8. They look quite good to me. I'll do some more testing and at different light levels and see if it looks to be fairly credible, but it's actually better than I expected it to be. So I think that this camera will be winging its way back to the northern hemisphere fairly promptly. So there you have, that's a Retinette IIA camera, fairly unusual. programmed exposure, I suppose you'd call it. You have no shutter speed settings there, you're just turning the dial to match the needle in the meter window, and it's giving a progressive change of shutter speeds from around a 30th at one end of the daylight scale to around a 500th at the other end of the scale. And the aperture is certainly shifting, and I think it was running, it was indicating something around the, what looked to me to be about f11. I know it goes down smaller than that. Oh, it might have been a bit higher, but I'm going to be testing this a little bit further yet before I send this home, just to see. What I wanted to do is satisfy myself that that needle, which looks bent to me, is giving mostly correct readings. And if I believe it's not giving correct readings, my next question will be, is if I straightened the needle out to the angle I think the needle should sit at, would that be indicating more correct readings? Of course, the way the world works, it's very likely that this camera will be going home, may never actually have a film put through it, or if it does, it'll only have one, so the whole matter might be moot. But I do like to make sure that the cameras are working as well as I possibly can. Everything is just a little bit extra fraught when you have a camera that is pretty much reliant on the meter working correctly, and it's a selenium meter and the cells are very tired. There you have it. I'm not going to add any more to this video. Thanks for watching.